Ellena had always been a woman of long silences, one of those who listened more than they spoke. Since she lost her son Matthew, the doctor who had inherited her composure and her calm way of looking at the world, her life became a puzzle of scattered memories. She lived in a modest house, on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, where every afternoon smelled of toasted bread and dried leaves. She spent her mornings tending her small garden, and her afternoons reading the letters Matthew had sent her. From his medical residency, although months had passed since his death, she still hoped to hear his voice behind some door. Everything changed one random Tuesday, when an everyday gesture, so simple it would have gone unnoticed, made her understand that grief isn't always silence, but a warning that one learns to heed in time. That day, Ellena was in the kitchen preparing chamomile tea when, through the window, she saw her daughter-in-law Ashley come out onto the patio with a black garbage bag in her hand. Her movements were quick, almost nervous. At first, she didn't pay attention. Ashley usually cleaned compulsively when she was restless. But something about the bag's contents caught her attention. A piece of blue fabric was sticking out, a color she recognized immediately. Her heart leapt. It was the old baby blanket Matthew had bought when Isabella was born. That same blanket had accompanied him through entire nights in the hospital, when his son slept in an armchair with the newborn. Girl in his arms. Ellena walked out onto the patio slowly, watching as Ashley placed the bag inside the bin and walked away without looking back. She couldn't understand how anyone could throw away something so full of history, much less someone who claimed to have loved Matthew. She waited for Ashley to leave with Isabella in the car, and when the street fell silent, Ellena put on some cleaning gloves, crossed the yard, and opened the dumpster. The smell of food scraps and hot plastic hit her. Full force, but she didn't hesitate. She pushed aside bags, dented cans, and damp boxes until she found the black bag. She placed it on the ground, opened it carefully, and among the peels and papers, she saw the blue fabric. She shook it twice, as if doing so would take away the contempt she had just suffered. Up close, she noticed that the quilt was heavier than usual, and that one of the side seams looked different, as if it had been done in a hurry. She hugged it to her chest for a moment, not out of nostalgia, but to calm the trembling that had risen up her arms. Then she carried it into the house, closed the door, and lowered the kitchen blind, as if she needed to hide from the world for what she was about to do. She spread the quilt on the dining room table and ran her fingers along the odd seam. She knew that thread well. It wasn't the original. She reached into the drawer where she kept her sewing kit, took out a pair of fine-tipped scissors, and patiently began to open the seam, pulling the thread without tearing the fabric. The inner bulge immediately appeared, something rectangular wrapped in plastic wrap and clear tape. She cut the tape, peeled back the plastic, and revealed an old phone, its casing scratched and its front glass dull. It didn't look like a sentimental relic. It seemed purposefully hidden. Ellena wasn't techie, but she knew how to charge a device. She plugged in the cable from the old universal charger she used for lamps and clocks, waited a few minutes and pressed the power button. The screen vibrated. A blue background, the time was off, and few icons. There was no signal, but enough battery to open the gallery. She took a deep breath before touching the screen, like someone opening a door that she didn't know where it led. The first thing she saw were photos she couldn't remember ever seeing. Ashley appeared in several of them, dressed in elegant clothes, posing in restaurants and hotel rooms with a man Ellena didn't know. In some images, they were holding hands. In others, they were kissing in front of a mirror. That man's face, with a trimmed beard and haughty gaze, was repeated over and over again. The photo archive had dates that coincided with the last months of Matthew's life. Her blood ran cold. She opened the message log, and what she read was even worse. Conversations between Ashley and a man named Hugh, where they talked about money, making him disappear, and leaving no trace. Sometimes they used codes, as if afraid of being discovered, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a simple affair. It was the planning of something much darker. Ellena stared at the screen, paralyzed. The light from the phone reflected her distraught face. The words, "Make him disappear," echoed in her head over and over again, like an echo impossible to extinguish. She felt a knot in her stomach and placed the device on the table, afraid she might drop it. For a moment, she thought it might all be a mistake. AI joke, an old file. But the dates, the recorded voices, and the bank transfers spoke for themselves. Reality began to crumble before her. The very day she thought she was rescuing a memory of the son she lost, she had opened the door to the horror of discovering how she had actually lost him. For several minutes, Ellena didn't move. She sat with her arms crossed over her chest, trying to calm the trembling in her hands. She remembered the night of the accident, the ringing of the phone, the hospital voice saying Matthew had fallen down the stairs. She remembered Ashley crying inconsolably on her shoulder, swearing it was careless, that he'd tripped while carrying his tools. And now it all seemed like a play. She felt rage, a silent kind of rage, the kind you don't shout but rather burns inside. She turned off the phone, rewrapped it, and hid it in the metal box where she kept Matthew's documents. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't go directly to the police. Not yet. She needed to fully understand what she had in her hands. She needed evidence, order, logic, something to give structure to this chaos. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her son's face in the photo on the wallpaper. She got up several times, turned on her phone, and reread the messages. There were details she hadn't noticed before, account numbers, small amounts that were repeated, transfers to a bank in another city. She wrote everything down in a notebook, in large, firm handwriting. If there was one thing she learned in her years as a mother and a widow, it was that the truth isn't found with impulse, but with patience. In the middle of the night, as the clock struck 3:30, she promised herself she wouldn't rest until she discovered what had been done to her son. If you, too, have ever felt like something wasn't right in your life, leave it in the comments and tell us where you're watching this story from. That thought, though simple, sustained her. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a woman beginning to wake up. The next morning, tiredness failed to erase her determination. She made strong coffee, sat at the table, and reviewed her notes from the night before. The bank statements, the messages, the dates. Everything seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle that someone had tried to hide under layers of normalcy. But she couldn't do it alone. She thought of Gloria, her lifelong neighbor, a retired nurse who had worked for decades at the same hospital where Ashley was the shift manager. If anyone could guide her on how to handle this situation without putting Isabella at risk, it was her. So she waited until mid-morning and walked over to her house. Gloria greeted her with a cup of tea and that mix of warmth and curiosity that always characterized her. At first, Ellena hesitated, but when she began to tell her about the blanket, her voice broke, and she ended up crying. Gloria listened without interrupting. When Ellena finished speaking, she picked up the phone and began reviewing her messages, frowning. "This isn't a simple affair, Ellie," she finally said, her tone grave. "There's a pattern here, and a purpose. Look at these transfers, and the dates. This has to do with money, and a lot of it." Ellena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She didn't want to believe that her daughter-in-law could have killed her own husband, but the evidence was too clear. They spent the entire afternoon reviewing data, and it was Gloria who found the first thread that would lead them further. 3 names of elderly patients who had died at the hospital under Ashley's care. They all had something in common that seemed like a coincidence but wasn't. Each family had made a generous donation after the death of their loved ones. And all those donations were linked to the same account that appeared on the phone. That night, Ellena barely managed to eat dinner. She sat in the armchair where Matthew used to read stories to Isabella, and for the first time in months she felt no comfort in being there. Everything around her seemed tainted by betrayal. She decided to call the hospital number the next day to confirm Ashley's appointments during the dates of the deaths Gloria had found. When she did, the result was terrifying. They matched exactly. 3 appointments, 3 deaths, 3 donations. This was no longer a suspicion of infidelity or dirty money. It was something much more serious. With a heavy heart, Ellena called Gloria and said, "I can't continue with this alone. If I keep quiet, it's as if I'm protecting her too." The next day, they went together to the local police station. The officer on duty, a young and distracted man, didn't seem to take them very seriously at first. But when Ellena placed the phone on the table and played one of the audio recordings, the atmosphere changed completely. That's when Detective Jack Roberts appeared, a man in his 50s with a tired but firm look, the kind who listens before speaking. He asked them to tell everything from the beginning. Ellena did so without omitting anything, although every word pained her. When she finished, the detective picked up the phone, checked some messages, and said in a low but clear voice, "This is not being filed. This is being investigated." It was the first time in a long time that Ellena felt someone believed her. Jack Roberts began working on the case with a meticulousness that impressed Ellena. He requested the hospital's medical records, the forensic reports for the 3 deceased patients, and the file on Matthew's death. Reviewing the documents, he discovered something disturbing. A full autopsy had not been performed in any of the cases. The causes had been listed as domestic accidents or natural complications. This lack of detail was the first indication of a cover-up. Roberts ordered a review of Ashley's financial records and sought judicial authorization to investigate her accounts. In the meantime, he advised Ellena to remain calm and not confront her daughter-in-law under any circumstances. "She mustn't suspect that we know," he warned. Ellena nodded, but deep down she knew that every day living under the same roof with a murderer would be silent torture. The following days were a test of endurance. Ashley acted as if nothing had changed. She cooked, laughed with Isabella, commented on the weather, and every everyday gesture was a provocation for Ellena. She slept with Matthew's phone hidden in a metal box inside the closet, checking it every night, fearing Ashley would discover it. Gloria visited her daily, bringing thermoses of coffee and sheets of notes they had prepared together. Together they began to connect the dots, the shifts, the payments, the names of the victims' relatives. Everything matched up. Every detail reinforced what they both already knew, but were afraid to say out loud. Matthew hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered, and his killer slept across the hall. The nights dragged on. Ellena could barely sleep, tormented by the thought that Ashley might show up in her room and discover she knew everything. Sometimes she heard footsteps in the hallway and held her breath until silence returned. Detective Roberts called her almost every day to update her on the progress. The warrants were in process, the accounts were being traced, and Matthew's file had been officially reopened. Hearing those words made her hands tremble. It wasn't just the relief of being listened to. It was confirmation that her intuition, that inner voice no one had wanted to listen to, had always been right. Gloria was with her every step, and together they kept meticulous records of dates, names, and amounts. Justice, though slow, was beginning to move. Meanwhile, Ashley continued to act as if nothing had happened. She went to work with the same impeccable smile and the same sweet manner. In the neighborhood, everyone still considered her an example of a professional and a mother. That public image protected her, and Ellena knew it. That's why she had to be patient. The detective had asked her not to change her routine or show distrust, so she did. They had breakfast together, talked about Isabella, feigned normalcy, but in every word, in every gesture, Ellena read another story. It was like living with a ghost who didn't know had already been exposed. Every day that passed was a silent war between appearances and truth. One afternoon, Detective Roberts called Ellena and asked her to come to the station. When she arrived, he was waiting for her, a file in his hand, and a grave expression. They'd found something. Preliminary account analysis showed large transfers to a man named Hugh Miller. Hearing that name, Ellena felt a chill. It was the same man who appeared in the phone messages, the same man in the photographs. Roberts explained that this man had a history of fraud and document forgery. The financial transactions coincided with the days following Matthew's death. It was clear this wasn't just an affair, but a conspiracy to collect the life insurance. Ellena clenched her fists, staring at the floor. There was no doubt anymore. Ashley had planned every step. That same night, while Ashley slept, Ellena turned her phone back on. She checked the emails, the audio recordings, the deleted messages she had managed to recover with Gloria's help. In one of them, Ashley wrote to Hugh, "Everything will go as planned. No one will suspect. Matthew was always too trusting." That sentence broke her inside. She closed her eyes, and the tears she had held back for weeks came out uncontrollably. She sat on the floor, holding the phone as if it were a cursed relic. She thought of Isabella, of the innocence of the little girl sleeping in her room, oblivious to the monster of a mother. That was the first time Ellena hoped justice would come quickly, not only for Matthew, but to save her granddaughter from the future that lay ahead. The next morning, Ellena accompanied Detective Roberts to give her formal statement. The investigation was no longer a mere suspicion. It was an open homicide case. When she signed her statement, her hands trembled. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling of betraying someone who had lived under her roof, of breaking the facade she had maintained for so long. But when she remembered Matthew's face, that son who always believed in the goodness of people, she understood that silence is also a form of complicity. Roberts congratulated her on her courage and assured her that she would not be alone. From that day on, the police placed discreet surveillance around her house. Ashley was not to suspect anything until they gathered irrefutable evidence. However, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to change. People noticed the patrol cars, the cars parked for hours. Some neighbors asked questions, others whispered. Ellena avoided explanations, simply saying that it was family business. At night, the ringing of the landline startled her. Each ring made her think Ashley had discovered something. Gloria advised her not to show fear, to stick to her routine, and to focus on Isabella. "She's the only pure thing left from all of this," she told her one afternoon, while they were knitting together on the porch. Ellena nodded, watching the girl play in the garden, oblivious to the hell unfolding around them. It was at that moment that she vowed to protect her no matter what. Weeks later, the results of Matthew's exhumation arrived at Robert's office. The report was overwhelming. Restraint marks were found on the forearms, bruises on the shoulders, and a head injury inconsistent with an accidental fall. Ellena had to sit down when she heard the coroner's reading. She had waited for that moment with a mixture of hope and terror, but hearing it read aloud was like reliving the night of the accident. Roberts assured her that this evidence would change the course of the case. "This is homicide, Ms. Collins," he said firmly, "and we won't stop until we prove it." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't the perfect justice one imagines in movies, but it was the truth breaking through so many lies. That same night, Gloria arrived with a folder she'd put together herself. It contained press clippings, medical reports, and old notes from the hospital where Ashley worked. Among the documents, there was a name that caught both of their attention: Lydia Torres. According to the file, Lydia had been a nurse who disappeared years earlier, without a trace. But even more disturbing was another coincidence. Lydia had been Isabella's biological mother, and her official cause of death was also head trauma from domestic fall. Gloria felt the air escape from her lungs. Not only had her son been murdered, but history was repeating itself with the same coldness. Ashley wasn't impulsive or desperate. She was methodical. She was dangerous. Roberts ordered the reopening of Lydia Torres's case and the request for all related forensic reports. The results confirmed what everyone feared. The injuries were identical to Matthew's, even down to the direction of the blows. The same medical examiner's signature appeared on both files, raising suspicions of a cover-up within the hospital. Ellena brought her hands to her face upon hearing the report. This wasn't a string of coincidences. It was a meticulous pattern of crimes disguised as accidents. Gloria, ever the pragmatist, took the initiative to review the complete list of patients under Ashley's care. The more they searched, the more names appeared with similar causes of death. There were dozens of lives snuffed out under the same narrative of falls or unexpected heart failure. Meanwhile, Ashley continued her life as if it seemed normal. She continued working at the hospital, attending charity events, and projecting an image of impeccable maternal devotion. But the pressure was beginning to crack that facade. After weeks of surveillance, Roberts uncovered evidence that she was secretly communicating with Hugh Miller through a number registered in another state. The police traced a series of transactions from Ashley's account to him, totaling more than $500,000. Ellena watched everything from a distance, feeling like she was living inside a nightmare without waking up. Each discovery brought her closer to the truth, but also left her with a bitter feeling. The monster had been inside her family for years, and no one had noticed. One night, as Ellena watched from the living room window, she saw a car pull up in front of the house. It was a black sedan, its lights off. A man remained inside, apparently waiting. Her heart raced. She immediately called Detective Roberts, who ordered additional surveillance. The next morning, they confirmed the vehicle was registered to a Hugh Miller. That was the final piece of evidence they needed to intervene. Over the next few weeks, the police followed Ashley's every move: calls, wire transfers, and travel. They discovered she had purchased plane tickets under a false identity and withdrawn large sums of cash. The escape plan was in motion. Roberts decided to act before she disappeared from the country. The operation took place one rainy morning. The patrol cars were deployed along several possible routes, and a team of officers intercepted Ashley as she was driving north on the interstate highway. In the trunk, they found a suitcase containing forged passports, jewelry, money, and a gun. They took her away in handcuffs, her head bowed, without saying a word. When Ellena received the call, she felt a tremor run through her. It wasn't immediate relief, but a strange feeling, a mixture of sadness and justice. She had imagined that moment many times, but she never imagined the reality would hurt so much. She looked at the blue blanket, folded on the couch, and thought of Matthew, of how it all began with rescuing a piece of fabric that had now become the key to everything. During the search of Ashley's home, the officers found something that left even Detective Roberts speechless. In the master bedroom, behind a false panel in the closet, was a small metal chest with a double lock. Inside, carefully organized, were several flash drives, external hard drives, and notebooks with detailed notes. In the videos, Ashley spoke directly to the camera, with terrifying coldness, explaining how she selected her victims, how she manipulated medical records, and how she justified each death as a correction of fate. In one of those files, she mentioned Matthew by name. It was a mistake to let him live that long. It almost ruined everything. That sentence was forever etched in Elena's mind. There was no room for doubt. She had planned everything, even her own husband's demise. The evidence was overwhelming. Roberts ordered the arrest of Hugh Miller, who was found in a roadside motel a few miles from the border. During interrogation, he confessed to helping Ashley stage the accidents, falsify documents, and move money between third-party accounts. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he detailed the entire scheme, from the manipulation of medical records to the murder of Lydia Torres, to gain custody of Isabella. When Ellena heard that part, she felt the air escape from her chest. Not only had she lost her, she had also witnessed the woman he loved destroy everything she touched. The prosecutor gathered the material, and in less than a week, the charges were filed. 6 counts of first-degree murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The trial began 3 months later, amid overwhelming media attention. The news report spoke of the nurse of death, the newscasts broadcast each hearing, and Ellena's neighbors barely left their homes. Ellena, on the other hand, never missed a single day. She sat in the front row, holding the blue blanket, silently watching. Ashley, dressed in a light gray suit, avoided looking at her. Her expression was impassive, almost blank. When the prosecutor presented the videos found in the vault, the entire courtroom fell silent. The images showed Ashley narrating her crimes in a serene tone, as if speaking from a doctor's prescription. Some attendees had to leave the room. Ellena stood firm, her gaze steady, remembering her son's words. The truth doesn't need to scream. It defends itself. Hugh Miller testified as the star witness. His voice shaking, he explained how Ashley had emotionally manipulated him, promising him a life together and the money from the insurance policies. He described every detail precisely: how Matthew was drugged, how the scene of the alleged accident was staged, and how Ashley collected the insurance just days after the death. The coldness with which he narrated this caused some jurors to look away. When he finished, the judge called a recess. Ellena stepped into the hallway, took a deep breath, and leaned against the wall. She had waited so long for justice, but hearing the events out loud shattered her again. Yet amid the pain, she felt something like peace. Finally, the truth had come out. On the day of the sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Cameras, reporters, and whispers formed a constant murmur, but Ellena heard nothing. Her entire world was reduced to the judge, the jury, and the woman she once called daughter. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts with no parole, absolute silence filled the air. Ashley remained motionless, as if she didn't grasp the weight of what she had just heard. Ellena closed her eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just let out a long breath, like someone releasing years of restraint in a single gesture. Reporters swarmed her as she left the building, but she didn't say a word. She walked to Detective Roberts' car, clutching the blanket in her hands, and simply nodded her thanks. That night, Ellena returned home and sat alone on the porch. The rain fell finely, steadily, soaking the plants in the garden Matthew had planted. The silence was heavy, but not empty. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. She knew justice wouldn't bring her son back, but it had given her something she thought was lost: the certainty that her love for him had been worth it. Inside the house, Isabella slept peacefully, cuddled with her favorite doll. Ellena watched her from the doorway and thought that this was Matthew's true legacy: his daughter's innocence and the strength she had inherited from her grandmother. Silently, she murmured a promise: "Your father is at peace, my child, and so am I." With Ashley's conviction, the court officially granted custody of Isabella to Ellena. The news felt bittersweet. She had won the right to raise her granddaughter, but at the cost of losing her son and destroying the family he had built. Isabella was only 5 years old and didn't fully understand what was happening. She frequently asked about her mother, and Ellena responded tenderly, but not falsely: "She's far away, love, and she won't be back soon." As the months passed, the little girl settled into the routine at her grandmother's house. The garden became her refuge. There she played, drew, and talked to the flowers, as if she found silent solace there. Ellena saw a spark of Matthew's soul in Isabella's every gesture. The connection was what kept her going. Little by little, the neighborhood returned to calm. The curious grew tired of talking about the case, and life went on. Ellena began to piece together her daily life with a serenity that only comes after chaos. She learned to enjoy the small routines: preparing Isabella's breakfast, watering the plants, writing in her diary. Sometimes, when the girl was asleep, she would open the drawer where she kept the blue comforter and stroke it, as if by doing so, she could touch her son once more. That fabric, once a symbol of loss, had become a reminder of strength. Because if she had learned anything from all of that, it was that the truth can break you, but it can also set you free. The passage of time brought her some peace of mind. Ellena would wake up early, make homemade bread, and listen to the radio as the sun streamed through the curtains. In those moments of domestic silence, she felt Matthew's presence in every corner. It wasn't a sad memory, but a constant companion. Isabella grew up strong and happy, with that mix of sweetness and determination that he also possessed. Sometimes, when the little girl stumbled and got up laughing, Ellena thought that life was slowly giving her back what grief had taken from her. She learned to let go of the noises of the past and look at the present with gratitude. She no longer lived based on fear or loss, but on the love that still lingered. One afternoon, Gloria visited her with a freshly baked apple pie. They sat on the porch watching Isabella run through the flowers. "I never thought we'd get to this point," Gloria said, pouring tea. Ellena smiled, with that serenity that only comes after a storm. "Me neither, but here we are. Living in the end is also an act of courage." They spent the afternoon talking about simple things: recipes, the weather, the garden. It was the first time in a long time that they spoke without mentioning the word justice. They both knew they no longer needed to utter it. Justice had arrived, and what remained now was learning to live with the echo of what survived. Years passed, and Elena's house filled with new photographs. Isabella on her first day of school, Isabella in her first uniform, Isabella holding her elementary school diploma. Each image was a quiet victory over the past. Ellena framed a photo of Matthew with their baby daughter and placed it next to the frame of the girl's school diploma. It was her way of keeping them together, even when time insisted on separating them. At night, when Isabella fell asleep, Ellena sat in front of the fireplace and wrote in a hardbound notebook. These weren't letters or confessions, but simple thoughts, what she had learned, what she wanted to leave her granddaughter as a legacy. She wrote about the value of truth, patience, and the power of listening to one's intuition when everything else seems silent. Over time, Isabella grew into a responsible teenager, with a strong character and a curious eye. She enjoyed accompanying her grandmother to the market, helping her with her shopping and listening to the stories about her father, which Ellena told with a mixture of tenderness and caution. There were details she still didn't reveal, not out of fear, but out of respect for the girl's age. "When you're older, you'll understand some things better," she would often tell her, and Isabella would nod without pressure. She was an empathetic young woman, capable of perceiving others' sadness and transforming it into caring. This made Ellena proud. The darkness of her family history hadn't contaminated her granddaughter's soul. On the contrary, it had strengthened it. When Isabella turned 18, Ellena decided it was time to tell her everything. She didn't do it with drama or tears, but with the serenity of someone who has learned that the truth frees more than it hurts. She took the metal box out of the closet, placed the blue blanket on the table, and said, "This belongs to your father, and to you too." Isabella looked at her in silence as she listened to the whole story: the accident, the suspicions, the investigation, the trial. As her grandmother spoke, she understood that her life had been born from an enormous sacrifice. There was no anger in her eyes, only sadness and respect. When Ellena finished, the young woman hugged her and whispered, "Thank you for not letting me grow up lying." That moment marked a turning point between them. That night, Isabella stayed up late, staring at the comforter that lay on her bed. She didn't see it as a symbol of tragedy, but as a testament to resilience. The next day at breakfast, she announced to her grandmother that she had made a decision. She would study pediatric medicine. "I want to save lives like Dad did," she said firmly. "I don't want his story to end in pain, but in purpose." Ellena smiled through lingering tears. She didn't need to say anything else. Deep down, she knew Matthew's life lived on in her daughter, transformed into a vocation that would heal others. And in that moment, she understood that true justice doesn't always come in the courts, but on the paths that love chooses to follow. The following years were a period of luminous calm for both of them. Isabella started university and became a brilliant student, respected for her empathy and commitment. During clinical internships, she often spent more time with patients than necessary, listening to their stories. She said she couldn't help thinking about all the people who had died in silence, without justice like her father and Lydia. Ellena, now older, waited for her every evening with dinner served, proud and excited to see her progress. Sometimes, as she watched her study surrounded by books, she thought that life had given her a second chance, not to forget, but to transform pain into a legacy that now healed others. As time passed, Ellena began to write her memories in a notebook. These weren't memoirs, intended for publication, but letters addressed to Isabella. She spoke of the fears she had felt, of the sleepless nights, of the courage it takes to face the truth without running away. Her handwriting was shaky, but firm. On one of the last pages, she left a phrase that Isabella would find years later. "Justice is served when love conquers silence." That sentence summed up her entire life. Each word carried the weight of what she had experienced, but also the lightness of someone who has made peace with the past. When Ellena died one quiet spring morning, the entire town turned out for the funeral. It wasn't a sad ceremony, but a serene farewell, as if everyone knew that this woman had fulfilled her mission. Isabella placed the blue blanket over the coffin before it was lowered, caressing the fabric with her fingers. She didn't cry in despair. She cried with gratitude. She knew that her grandmother had left her something much greater than an inheritance or a story. She had left her a moral compass so she would never get lost, no matter how dark life became. After the funeral, she returned home and opened Elena's notebook. She reread every page, every word, and in the silence of the evening, she understood that love, when it is true, does not die. It transforms into purpose. Years later, Isabella was already a doctor. On her hospital desk, next to her stethoscope and patient files, she kept a photo of her grandmother. On the back, in blue ink, it read, "So you remember that? The truth also heals." That phrase accompanied her on difficult days when she had to deliver bad news or comfort a family. In those moments, she felt Elena's presence like an invisible whisper, reminding her that every act of compassion is a form of justice. And if this story moved you, please share it so more people remember that the truth always finds a way. Thus, the story of pain that began with a blanket in the trash became a chain of hope that continued to grow with each life touched by kindness. Over the years, Isabella founded a small medical volunteer program in rural areas. She called it Blue Blanket, in honor of the blanket that had changed her family's destiny. The initiative offered free care to children in forgotten communities, and over time, it transformed into a project recognized for its humanity. Whenever someone asked her the name, Isabella would recount, without going into details, that behind those two words lay a story of love, pain, and redemption. She said, "It all began with a woman who wouldn't settle for a lie, a grandmother who chose the truth even when it hurt." Her voice always cracked slightly when she mentioned it, but she did so with pride. "My grandmother taught me that justice doesn't always require fuss, only perseverance," she would repeat to her students. The original quilt still existed. It was kept in a wooden box inside Isabella's office, neatly folded next to a photo of Matthew and Ellena. Many patients stopped to look at it, intrigued by its story. Some believed it was a simple ornament, but for Isabella, it was a symbol of everything she had learned, that even the smallest gestures, rescuing a piece of fabric, asking an awkward question, not looking away, can change the course of a life. When a tiring day was over, she would often sit alone in the office, stroking the edge of the quilt. In those silences, she felt the same quiet strength her grandmother had that day, when she faced the horror with her heart in her hand. Over time, Manto Azul grew larger than Isabella ever imagined. Young doctors from across the country joined the project, inspired by her story and the way she spoke about medicine. as an act of service, not prestige. At a university conference, someone asked her what motivated her to create something like this. Isabella smiled, looked at the audience, and replied, "Because there was a woman who chose not to remain silent. Everything I am, I owe to her courage." That phrase went viral on social media, and soon the program received international support. Without intending to, Isabella had transformed family grief into a movement of compassion that continued to save lives. At home one winter night, Isabella pulled Ellena's notebook off the shelf. It was worn, with bent corners and yellowed pages. She opened it to the last page, where her grandmother had written, "If you ever doubt, listen to your heart. It knows when something doesn't fit." She smiled as she read it, because she understood that those words weren't just a warning, but a way of life. She closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and looked out the window. Outside, the snow was falling slowly, covering the world in white. In that silence, she thought life had granted her what Ellena always sought: peace. Years later, when Isabella was already internationally recognized for her medical work, she was invited to give a lecture at the same hospital where her father had worked. She walked confidently onto the stage, wearing a blue mantle name badge on her white coat. She spoke of ethics, empathy, and justice, but above all, she spoke of the importance of not ignoring one's intuition. "If something inside you tells you something is wrong, listen to it," she said to a hushed audience. In the front row, some of Matthew's former colleagues listened, moved, remembering the young doctor who had once filled those same rooms with hope. At the end of the talk, Isabella showed a projected photo. Her father, holding her, with the blue blanket in the background. The entire room rose to applaud. That night, upon returning home, Isabella laid the quilt on the sofa and lit a candle next to Ellena's portrait. She gazed into the flame for a long time, thinking about how it all began with a simple act of love, a grandmother who couldn't bear to see a memory thrown away. The truth had destroyed a life, but it had also saved many more. She closed her eyes and smiled, feeling a calm beyond words, because, deep down, she understood that Ellena's story wasn't just that of a mother who sought justice, but that of all people who refuse to give up when the world demands silence. And so, as long as the candle continued to burn, the light of the blue quilt lived on, illuminating entire generations with its silent promise of truth and love.